There is a quiet question many of us carry, often buried beneath survival, responsibility, and the daily noise of life. Why does this pain keep repeating? Why do certain struggles feel inherited, as if they were written into us long before we had a voice to resist them? When we look at something like Psalm 144, we might be tempted to read it only as a cry for protection or victory. But beneath the words, there is something deeper and awakening. A realization that what feels like a curse is often a pattern, a wound, a story that has lived unexamined within us. Awareness is where everything begins, even though it often feels like the most uncomfortable place to stand. Most of us move through life reacting rather than observing, repeating emotional patterns that seem automatic, almost as if they are stitched into our identity. We tell ourselves that this is just who we are, that our anger, our fear, our insecurity, or even our sense of unworthiness is fixed. But what if these patterns are not who we are, but rather what we have learned? What if they are adaptations, responses formed in moments when we didn't have the power, the language, or the support to process what we were experiencing? To become aware is to pause long enough to notice. It is to step outside the constant flow of reaction and ask what is really happening within me right now. That question alone can feel unsettling because it removes the distraction and brings us face to face with ourselves. Awareness doesn't immediately fix anything, and that's why many people avoid it. It reveals truths that can be painful, such as recognizing how deeply certain beliefs have shaped our lives, or how long we have been operating from a place of fear rather than freedom. Inherited patterns are not always obvious. They can come through family dynamics, cultural conditioning, or early experiences that quietly taught us how to see the world. Maybe you learned that love must be earned, so you constantly overextend yourself to gain approval. Maybe you absorbed the belief that vulnerability is dangerous, so you built walls that now keep connection at a distance. These patterns often feel like survival strategies, and in many ways they once were. But what once protected you can eventually begin to limit you. Awareness breaks this cycle not by force but by illumination. When you begin to see a pattern clearly, it loses some of its unconscious power. For example, instead of simply reacting with anger, you start to notice the feeling rising within you. You recognize the trigger, the tension in your body, the thoughts forming in your mind. In that moment of noticing, there is space, a small but significant gap between stimulus and response. And within that space lies the possibility of choice. This doesn't mean the pattern disappears overnight. Awareness is not a one-time event, it is a practice. It requires patience and honesty, and often a willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. You may begin to notice the same pattern repeating again and again, and that can feel frustrating. But even that noticing is progress, because repetition seen consciously is different from repetition lived unconsciously. There is also a kind of compassion that naturally emerges from awareness. When you start to understand where your patterns come from, you begin to soften toward yourself. You realize that your reactions were not random flaws, but meaningful responses to past experiences. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean approaching yourself with curiosity instead of judgment. And that shift alone can begin to change the way you relate to your own pain. Breaking inherited patterns is not about rejecting your past, but about understanding it deeply enough that it no longer controls you. Awareness allows you to trace the roots of your behaviors and gently question whether they still serve you. It invites you to rewrite the narrative, not by denying what has been, but by choosing what comes next. Pain is something we are taught to avoid, suppress, or escape from as quickly as possible. From an early age, many of us learn that discomfort is a problem to be fixed rather than a signal to be understood. When something hurts emotionally or physically, the instinct is often to distract ourselves, to numb the feeling, or to push through it without asking what it might be trying to communicate. But what if pain is not simply an enemy? What if it is, in many cases, a message that carries meaning about our inner world? When we look closely, pain often points to something unmet within us. It can reflect a need for connection, safety, validation, or rest that has been overlooked or denied. For example, the pain of rejection is not just about the event itself. It can echo a deeper longing to feel accepted and valued. The anxiety that arises in certain situations may not be random. It may be rooted in past experiences where we felt unsafe or out of control. In this way, pain becomes a kind of language, expressing what we have not yet fully acknowledged. The difficulty is that many of us have been conditioned to interpret pain as weakness or failure. We judge ourselves for feeling it, adding a second layer of suffering on top of the original experience. Instead of listening to the message, we criticize the messenger. This creates a cycle where pain intensifies, not because it is inherently overwhelming, but because it is being resisted and misunderstood. When we fight against our own inner signals, we lose the opportunity to learn from them. To begin seeing pain as a message requires a shift in perspective. It asks us to move from avoidance to curiosity. Rather than asking, how do I get rid of this feeling, we begin to ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? This doesn't mean that every instance of pain has a simple or immediate answer. Some messages are complex, layered, and tied to experiences we may not fully remember or understand right away. But the act of asking the question itself opens a door. Consider how the body responds to physical injury. Pain signals that something needs attention, perhaps rest, care, or protection. Ignoring that signal can lead to further harm. Emotional pain functions in a similar way. It highlights areas within us that require acknowledgement and care. When we listen to it, we gain insight into our boundaries, our needs, and our limits. When we ignore it, those unmet needs often find other ways to surface, sometimes in more intense or disruptive forms. There is also a profound connection between pain and authenticity. Often the pain we feel is linked to moments when we are out of alignment with ourselves, when we are saying yes instead of no, when we are suppressing our true feelings, or when we are trying to meet expectations that do not resonate with who we are. In this sense, pain can act as a guide, pointing us back toward a more honest, integrated way of being. Learning to listen to pain does not mean becoming overwhelmed by it or allowing it to define us. It means creating a space where it can be acknowledged without judgment. This requires patience because the messages within pain are not always clear or comfortable. It also requires courage because listening may lead us to confront truths we have been avoiding. Over time, as we develop this relationship with our pain, it begins to shift. It becomes less of an adversary and more of an informant, offering insights that can guide our growth and healing. Instead of feeling trapped by it, we start to understand its purpose, and in that understanding, we find the possibility of responding differently. What we don't heal does not simply disappear. It adapts, hides, and eventually repeats itself in ways that often feel confusing and uncontrollable. Many of the patterns we struggle with in adulthood are not new problems, but old wounds expressing themselves through new situations. The mind and body have a remarkable way of holding on to unresolved experiences, especially those that were too overwhelming to process at the time they occurred. When those experiences are left unaddressed, they continue to influence how we perceive the world, how we relate to others, and how we respond to stress. Repetition is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is often a sign that something within you is still seeking resolution. You may notice yourself drawn to similar kinds of relationships, facing the same conflicts, or reacting with the same intensity in different circumstances. On the surface, it can feel like bad luck or external misfortune. But when we look more closely, these recurring patterns often have roots in earlier experiences where certain emotional needs were not met or where certain beliefs about ourselves formed. For example, someone who experienced inconsistency or neglect early in life may unconsciously seek out relationships that mirror that same instability. Not because they desire pain, but because the familiar, even when it is harmful, can feel safer than the unknown. The nervous system learns what to expect based on past experiences, and it tends to recreate environments that match those expectations. In this way, the past is not just something that happened, it becomes something that continues to shape the present. Healing begins when we start to recognize these patterns without immediately judging ourselves for them. It requires a willingness to ask deeper questions. Where have I felt this before? What does this situation remind me of? What belief about myself is being activated right now? These questions can open a pathway to understanding the connection between past and present, allowing us to see that our reactions are not random but meaningful. Unhealed wounds often carry emotional charges that are disproportionate to the current situation. A small disagreement might trigger an intense fear of abandonment, or a minor criticism might feel like a deep personal rejection. These responses are not about the present moment alone, they are echoes of earlier experiences that have not yet been integrated. When we begin to recognize this, we can start to separate what belongs to the past from what is actually happening now. This process is not about blaming the past or becoming stuck in it. It is about acknowledging its impact so that it no longer unconsciously dictates our choices. Healing involves bringing awareness to these old wounds, allowing ourselves to feel what was once suppressed, and gradually creating new ways of responding. It is not a linear journey, and it does not happen all at once. There may be moments of progress followed by moments of setback, but even those setbacks can become opportunities for deeper understanding. As we begin to heal, the repetition starts to lose its grip. Situations that once triggered automatic reactions become moments where we can pause, choose differently. We may still feel the pull of old patterns, but we are no longer completely controlled by them. Over time, this creates a shift in how we experience ourselves and the world around us. The idea that what we don't heal, we repeat is not meant to be discouraging, it is an invitation. It points to the possibility that by turning toward our wounds with honesty and compassion, we can interrupt the cycles that have been shaping our lives and begin to create something new. Compassion is often misunderstood as something soft, passive, or even indulgent. In reality, it is one of the most powerful forces for transformation because it changes the way we relate to our own inner world. Most people are far harsher with themselves than they would ever be with another human being. There is an internal voice that criticizes, judges, and demands perfection, especially in moments of struggle. When we make mistakes, feel overwhelmed, or fall back into old patterns, that voice becomes louder, reinforcing the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with us. This inner harshness does not create change, it creates resistance. When we judge ourselves, we tend to either shut down or push harder in ways that are unsustainable. We may try to control our behavior through willpower alone, but without understanding the underlying causes, those efforts often lead to frustration and burnout. Compassion, on the other hand, creates the conditions where real change can take place because it allows us to approach ourselves with openness rather than fear. To be compassionate with yourself is not to deny responsibility or avoid growth. It is to recognize that your behaviors, even the ones you struggle with, have roots. They come from experiences, adaptations, and attempts to cope with situations that may have been difficult or overwhelming. When you begin to see this, the question shifts from what is wrong with me to what happened to me. That shift alone can soften internal tension and create space for deeper understanding. Compassion invites curiosity. Instead of reacting to your own pain with avoidance or criticism, you begin to lean toward it with a willingness to listen. You might notice a feeling of anxiety and, rather than immediately trying to suppress it, you ask what it needs. You might observe a pattern of self-sabotage and, instead of labeling yourself as incapable, you explore what fear or belief might be driving that behavior. This kind of inquiry is only possible when there is a sense of safety within yourself, and compassion is what creates that safety. There is also a physiological dimension to this. When we are harsh and critical toward ourselves, the body often responds with stress. The nervous system becomes activated, preparing for threat or danger. In that state, it is much harder to access clarity, creativity, or emotional regulation. Compassion, by contrast, can help calm the nervous system. It signals that, even in the presence of difficulty, there is no need to attack yourself. This creates a more stable internal environment where reflection and change can occur more naturally. Transformation is not just about changing behavior, it is about changing the relationship you have with yourself. Without compassion, any attempt at growth can feel like a constant battle. With compassion, growth becomes a process of unfolding rather than forcing. You begin to recognize that healing is not about becoming a different person, but about reconnecting with parts of yourself that may have been neglected or misunderstood. It is also important to understand that compassion does not mean complacency. It does not mean accepting harmful patterns without question. Instead, it provides the foundation from which you can address those patterns more effectively. When you approach yourself with kindness, you are more likely to stay engaged in the process of change, even when it is difficult. You are less likely to give up or become overwhelmed by setbacks. As compassion deepens, it begins to influence not only how you see yourself, but how you see others. The same understanding you develop internally starts to extend outward. You recognize that others too are shaped by their experiences, their wounds, and their unmet needs. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it can foster a greater sense of empathy and connection. In this way, compassion becomes more than just a feeling. It becomes a way of relating to yourself, to your past, and to the ongoing process of transformation that unfolds within you. True strength is often misunderstood as the ability to suppress, endure, or push through without showing any sign of vulnerability. Many people grow up believing that to be strong means to ignore their emotions, to silence their fears, and to carry their burdens without complaint. This idea of strength may appear effective on the surface, especially in environments that reward toughness and resilience. But over time, suppression does not eliminate what is felt, it only buries it deeper, where it continues to influence thoughts, behaviors, and even the body in ways that are not always visible. When emotions are suppressed, they do not disappear, they accumulate. They can surface as tension, irritability, anxiety, or even physical symptoms that seem disconnected from any obvious cause. Suppression requires constant effort because it is essentially a form of internal resistance. It is the act of pushing something away that is trying to be acknowledged. This creates a kind of inner conflict, where one part of you is trying to maintain control while another part is seeking expression. Over time, this conflict can become exhausting, leaving you feeling disconnected not only from your emotions but also from yourself. Understanding, on the other hand, offers a different path. It does not demand that you eliminate your emotions, but rather that you become aware of them, explore them, and make sense of them. When you choose to understand what you are feeling, you begin to build a relationship with your inner world instead of fighting against it. This shift requires courage, because it means turning toward experiences that may be uncomfortable or even painful. But it is within this process of turning toward rather than away that true strength begins to emerge. To understand an emotion is to ask where it comes from and what it represents. For instance, anger is often seen as something negative that should be controlled or hidden. But when you look beneath the surface, anger can be a signal that a boundary has been crossed or that something important to you has been threatened. Anxiety might reflect a sense of uncertainty or a lack of safety. Sadness can point to loss, disappointment, or unmet expectations. Each emotion carries information, and when you take the time to understand that information, you gain insight into your needs, your values, and your experiences. Process also involves recognizing that your emotional responses are shaped by your past. What you feel in the present moment is often connected to earlier experiences that have left an imprint on your mind and body. Understanding allows you to trace those connections, to see how certain patterns developed, and to question whether they are still serving you. It transforms your reactions from something that feels automatic and uncontrollable into something that can be observed and eventually influenced. There is a quiet strength in being able to sit with your emotions without immediately trying to change them. It means you are no longer afraid of what is happening within you. Instead of being overwhelmed, you become an observer. Someone who can notice the rise and fall of feelings without being completely consumed by them. This does not mean that the emotions lose their intensity right away, but it does mean that you are no longer at their mercy in the same way. Understanding also opens the door to more intentional choices. When you are aware of what you are feeling and why, you are better equipped to respond in ways that align with your values rather than reacting impulsively. You might still feel anger, but instead of lashing out, you can communicate your needs more clearly. You might still feel fear, but instead of avoiding a situation, you can approach it with greater awareness and preparation. In this way, strength becomes less about control and more about connection. It is not the absence of emotion, but the ability to engage with it in a way that is honest and grounded. It is the willingness to face yourself fully without the need to hide or suppress what is there. And in that willingness, a more stable and authentic form of strength begins to take shape. Ending the curse is often imagined as a dramatic, external event, something that happens suddenly, where everything shifts overnight and the weight of the past disappears without effort. But in reality, what we call a curse is rarely a single force acting upon us. It is usually a collection of patterns, beliefs, and emotional imprints that have shaped how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. To end it is not to erase the past, but to reclaim authorship over your own story in the present. Reclaiming your story begins with recognizing that much of what you believe about yourself may not have originated from you. Early experiences, relationships, and environments often shape the narratives we carry. You may have learned, directly or indirectly, that you are not enough, that your voice does not matter, or that love must be earned through sacrifice. Over time, these beliefs become internalized, and they start to feel like truth rather than interpretation. They influence your decisions, your relationships, and even your sense of possibility. To reclaim your story is to question those inherited narratives. It is to ask, is this belief truly mine? And does this perspective reflect who I am now, or is it a reflection of what I once experienced? This process is not about rejecting everything from your past, but about discerning what is aligned with your present self and what is no longer serving you. It requires honesty, because some of these beliefs are deeply ingrained and may have guided your life for many years. There is also a shift in responsibility that takes place here. When we see ourselves as bound by a curse, it can create a sense of powerlessness, as if our lives are being dictated by forces beyond our control. Reclaiming your story does not deny that you have been shaped by your experiences, but it does challenge the idea that you are permanently defined by them. It introduces the possibility that, while you may not have chosen what happened to you, you can begin to choose how you relate to it. This choice is not always easy or immediate. It unfolds in small, deliberate steps. It might look like setting a boundary where you once remained silent. It might involve expressing a need that you previously ignored, or making a decision that aligns with your values rather than your fears. Each of these actions, however small they may seem, represents a movement away from old patterns and toward a more conscious way of living. Reclaiming your story also means allowing yourself to see your own resilience. The very fact that you have adapted, survived, and continued moving forward is evidence of strength, even if that strength was expressed in ways that are no longer helpful. When you begin to recognize this, the narrative shifts from one of limitation to one of capacity. You are no longer just someone who has been affected by circumstances. You are someone who has the ability to respond, to learn, and to grow. There is a certain discomfort that comes with this process because it removes the familiarity of old patterns. Even when those patterns are painful, they can feel predictable. Stepping into a new way of being requires facing uncertainty, and that can bring up fear. But it is within that uncertainty that new possibilities exist. It is where you begin to experience yourself not as a repetition of the past, but as someone capable of creating something different. Over time, as you continue to make choices that reflect your awareness and understanding, the sense of being bound by a curse begins to fade. It is replaced by a growing sense of agency, where you recognize that your life is not a fixed script, but an evolving narrative. And in that recognition, you step into a more active role, shaping your path with intention rather than simply following what has been laid out before you.